My name is Casey Jones, and I'm partnering with the National Indian Education Association to bring you a series of text talks on text-based planning. Today we're going to start out with a qualitative text analysis, which allows educators to get a deeper look at the text that they're about to put before their students. So let's go ahead and get our materials ready before we jump in. You can do this with picture books, texts that are in your curriculum, or articles. What I like to have on hand are pens, pencils, highlighters, post-it notes, notebooks, anything that I can use to engage with the text. Even though this session will be short, in order to practice what you are learning, it is best that you go ahead and have your materials as you follow along with us. As we approach analyzing a text, it is important to really understand why we want to take a text-centered focus. These three key shifts in ELA and literacy have driven many of the changes in our instruction lately. The first shift is complexity. Students should have regular practice with complex text and the academic language found in those texts. Next, the focus is on evidence. Reading, writing, and speaking should be based on evidence found in the text, whether those are literary and informational. And the third, one of my favorites, is knowledge. The text that we use, whether nonfiction or fiction, should be helping students to build knowledge, a cohesive, coherent series of knowledge. When you take a closer look at the shifts, you'll notice that they are connected by the word text in all three shifts. That is why we focus on a text-centered aspect of instruction. The image on the screen gives you a very good perspective of what text-centered instruction looks like. When we talk about the text at the center, we begin to use complex and quality text in order to teach students all of these aspects. We think of building their vocabulary and their knowledge through the text. We focus our tasks around the text, and we pull the standards that we are teaching around from the text. All of our instruction, our assessments, our discussions, anything that happens in the classroom comes from that quality text so that student learning is grounded in the text itself. So the question you ask then is, so what does text-based instruction or text-centered instruction look like? I like to think of it in 5 T's. When I am planning, I want to make sure that I have quality text that I'm planning from. I want to craft my targets from the standards and the text that I am teaching. I want to be sure that I integrate technology and manipulatives into the lesson, and I really make sure that the tasks that students are doing are grounded in the text and the targets that I'm working towards. All of these elements are centered around a topic in which I want students to build their knowledge upon. Once you cohesively build all of these 5 aspects, you can call it text-based or text-centered instruction, and you also know that you are aligning your instruction so that it is more cohesive for student learning. Though it may not look like it at first, this is actually a completely different way to approach planning. Previously, our idea of planning was to start with standards first, and then determine which text or which way you were going to teach those standards. This type of approach is a little more balanced, especially when you're using close reading of text. In this case, we know we keep in mind the standards that we are going to teach, but we look at the text first and we let the text and the content or the knowledge we're building guide our instruction. We analyze text, we pull our questions from the text, and more importantly, we look at the standards that are best aligned or come from that text, and then that helps us to guide where we place the text in instruction, and also helps us make connections across other text. So instead of it being a standards-based or standards-first approach, it is a text-based or text-first approach. We will be focusing really just on phase 1 during this session. Phase 1 has to do with your deep engagement of the text, and it's the analysis phase. And so we will look at examples of how to analyze a text beyond just the quantitative aspect, such as Lexile measures, but how to really dig in and look at the quality of the text and pull out some of those key understandings and pull out the complexities of the text so that we can determine the questioning and the standards as we move into phase 2. To understand the purpose of a qualitative analysis, we need to step back and look at text complexity as a whole. There are 3 different facets of determining how complex a text is. And remember, in this case, text complexity doesn't mean that it is a difficult or complicated text. It just means that it has many facets that cause it to be rich. The first thing you look at is the quantitative aspect. Many times this will come in the form of a lexile measure or a readability level that is looking at word length, the frequency of words, sentence length and structure, and that readability overall. Then you look at the qualitative aspect. This looks at the text itself, the language present in the text, the demands on the reader for knowledge, how many levels of purpose and meaning there are. It looks at the structure of the text and what can be pulled apart and where the complexity in reading that text would come in. The third part, which becomes more personal to the teacher, is looking at the reader and task. How interested or motivated are the readers? How mature are they to understand the material that's in the text itself? And what is the demand of the task presented? Many times if you have a higher demand of a task, then you would have a lower complexity of the text to accompany that task. What we will be focusing on today is the qualitative aspect. When we are talking about lexile levels, we are looking at a shift from previous readability levels to a higher push towards more rigorous reading levels. The column all the way on the right are the recommended grade bands now in the Common Core era. When you get a lexile level reading for a text, the number itself may indicate what grade band it's recommended for, but as you can see in this example, a lexile level or a readability level alone is not enough to let us know the complexity or quality of a text. It is very critical that we do a qualitative analysis so that we don't have incidences such as this one, John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, that receives a lexile reading that it falls in the 2nd to 3rd grade reading band. Once you actually dig into the materials in the text itself, you'll find that it is too mature for that reading level and is actually typically read in high school or even college level courses. That qualitative aspect of analyzing a text before putting it before students is so critical in creating a complete perspective on the complexity of the text itself. If you are ready to engage in a qualitative analysis with me during this session, go ahead and pause the recording and make sure that you have your text at hand that you want to analyze. Where we're going to begin is first taking the time to read a text. I am going to be analyzing a speech by Oglala Chief Red Cloud. Over the next few minutes, I will demonstrate a qualitative analysis, and then you can pause the recording and try it yourself. The first step that we want to look at actually goes hand in hand with step 2. But as we're reading through, we're going to look at 4 different quadrants of qualitative complexity, as well as think about what are the key understandings or takeaways from this text that I want students to have. When you look at the qualitative quadrants, you're going to see that you're going to be looking in 4 different areas. Those complexities may not be in all 4 areas, but what you will say about a text and how you will determine if it's complex will fall in 1 or more of these 4 quadrants. As you are reading and analyzing for planning, you want to look at the meaning of the text, how many layers of meaning, what is the purpose of the text. You want to be looking at the complexity of the structure of the text. What is the sequencing? What is the genre of the text? You also want to be looking at the language of the text. Are there dialects used? Is there figurative language? What is the vocabulary demand of the text? And the last quadrant, knowledge. You want to look at how much knowledge does the reader need to have coming into the text, and how much knowledge will the reader be able to glean from the text. I'm going to give you a few questions as guides in each of these 4 quadrants. As you are looking at the meaning of the text, you want to ask yourself, is the meaning explicit or implicit? Are there multiple levels that students will have to work through? Will students have to make inferences, or is it clearly stated the author's purpose? What is the author's purpose? And is this content mature enough for students, or is it too mature? How much will I have to scaffold for students to get the meaning of this text? When you're looking at structure, you want to ask yourself, is the organization clear or ambiguous? If it's informational, there may be specific structures that students can look at to make meaning of the text. Sometimes creative writing, such as poetry or short stories, are a little more difficult to navigate, especially when they have flashbacks or it's not in chronological order. You want to look at the features that guide readers. Are there headers? Are there titles? Does the author use bold words or illustrations to support student learning? Are there connections being made across the ideas within the text? Is it explicit, or again, do students have to make inferences? One of the pieces that we tend to look at also as teachers is language, but looking at the language is not just about the vocabulary. You want to look at how concrete or abstract is the language. Is there a lot of figurative language or symbolism being used? What about the comparison between Tier 2 and Tier 3 words in vocabulary that students must maneuver through? Are sentences varied? Are they short? Are they compound or complex? And is the language archaic or highly academic or dialectal? The last piece is looking at knowledge. Does the reader have to have domain-specific knowledge to understand? Are references in the text to something outside, events that they would need to know? Are there a lot of allusions in the text? Do students need to come in with a lot of outside information in order to understand what's going on? And will students gain a lot of knowledge or understanding by reading this text? When we ask these kinds of questions as we are going through the planning process, we can get a good understanding of what students will encounter as they are going through the text as well. Looking at each one of these categories helps us to see, where is the complexity in this text? Is it complex in meaning but maybe less complex in language, so that students will be able to navigate the language but we will have to support them in understanding meaning? The reason this step is so critical is because we want to encounter the complexities before we put them before students. We want to be able to ask the best questions that will help them to break down the text so that they can glean not just knowledge, but also learning in language structures, grammar, writing, and other tasks that are put before them. In the following clip, I will walk through the process myself and model how I do it when I'm approaching a text. As I'm going through the text, I keep in mind that during a qualitative analysis, I'm looking at the 4 quadrants of complexity. I look for the complexity in meaning, structure, language, and the knowledge experience that students will have with the text. These 4 quadrants are always in my mind as I'm reading through, looking at the vocabulary, looking at the structure, the sequencing of the text, looking at the text features. I also like to think about how much knowledge students will have to have in order to understand the meaning of the text and how much knowledge they would gain from it. So as I read through, I take notes on particular words, Tier 2 and Tier 3 vocabulary that I might need to focus on. I also make notes in areas where I could ask questions or where we need to dig a little deeper. But these are all happening as I'm reading through the text and experiencing it the first time like a student might. I like to take notes and keep track of these. In picture books, a lot of times I'll use post-it notes, but sometimes if I'm able to read an article or have the text in print, that makes it much easier for me to keep track of my notes. Thinking about questioning is important too, because when we go through phase 2 of our planning, we will look at these scaffolding charts in order to compose questions that lead students to a deeper understanding of the meaning. This is such a critical part of the process because it allows us to be prepared for what students will face as they are engaging in the text as well. When I first started incorporating qualitative analysis into my lesson planning, I used a text-based guide such as the one you see on the screen. Once I became more comfortable with the process, I was able to change around the format as well as make more annotations on the text itself. But when you're getting started, this is actually very helpful in thinking about the process, phase 1 and phase 2. So let's go ahead and try a quick example. I want to demonstrate some of the work that I've done lately. My possible line of inquiry for this unit is that I want students to see what civil rights are and then how we protect them. I want them to see this from the past and the present, particularly around Native American activism. Some of the questions I might be asking are these on the screen. How do we practice the First Amendment? What is the First Amendment? Because we see right now a current state of protest and reaction towards things that are going on in the world around us. And so I want students to question that and see how this has been taking place for many years. Some of the categories we might look at, I'm thinking about public speaking, or what is a protest? How do we do them silently or publicly? How does it incorporate itself into music or art or religious tolerance? How do people use publications? Any of these things around a type of activism or advocacy. So as I go into this text, these possible categories or questions are in my mind. What you see now on the screen is an example of a couple of speeches by Red Cloud, chief of the Oglala Sioux. And I wanted to go through these speeches and see if they would be a great example of activism. One of the things in my mind is the recent protest for the Dakota Access Pipeline. And so I'm thinking, considering that this is close to home in that situation and that he's talking about some of the same issues that they're dealing with now, I want to see if this is a complex and quality text to put before students for them to think about protesting, advocacy, civil rights, and just a historical connection to Native American activism. So what you see on the screen is just my notes, my selection of vocabulary, highlighting things that need to be drawn out. And when I'm done with the text and planning, that's what it will look like before I begin to craft specific questions and pull out specific words and phrases that we're going to use. This is my way of engaging in the text that I want to model for students so that they begin to engage in text this way. The Lexile level for this is 1060, which could put it in the 6th to 8th grade range, or even the lower 9th to 10th grade range. But I want to see qualitatively how would this be useful for students, whether they are in 6th grade or in 9th grade, because I know that there is a range in which I can use this text. Because we're only looking at the first round of qualitative analysis in the first phase of planning, I've given an example of what I saw in the text itself in the 4 quadrants of the qualitative analysis. And so if you look on the screen, you'll see that what I found was that the most complex part of these texts or these speeches is that in the language. The speech is written in a very lofty and sometimes what feels like maybe archaic sentence structures. There's a heavy use of figurative language, and because of the Native American emphasis on naming things due to their function and not just a name, there are phrases in this speech such as glittering trinkets, iron road, dangerous snake, spirit water, shining things that reference something other than what they are actually naming. And students will have to pull through some of this language in order to understand what Red Cloud is truly trying to say. Chief Red Cloud is very explicit in his meaning, and the structure is very straightforward and conducive to a high quality speech, but the language choice is really where students will need some of that scaffolding and that support. That's also where the beauty of this text comes from. Students will not have to have an extensive background knowledge to understand why Chief Red Cloud is upset and how he is responding. However, if they understand the references to Little Piney, to the Iron Road, and the history of what was specifically going on in 1866, then that will make the meaning more relevant. And so what I will do is I will look for texts that explain or make connections to what's happening at this point so that they can begin to see that there is a connection beyond just what Chief Red Cloud is expressing in the text. While I'm doing this process, I'm also looking at key takeaways because I want students to walk away from this text with a definite understanding or an answer to our line of inquiry. And so I kind of thought of 2 takeaways that are possible with this text. One, I want them to see that the exchange between Native Americans and the white man has been extensive, and that Native Americans are exploited in these exchanges, and to get an idea of how Chief Red Cloud is passionate in his response and what he's feeling. I want them to see that activism was alive in 1866 and it's still alive today, and that it's necessary to speak out and express feelings, but there's also other methods to doing this. So I want them to parallel what's going on in Chief Red Cloud's time period to what's going on today with something like the Dakota Pipeline Access protest. There's also a skill factor. Because the language is the complex and beautiful part of this text, I want students to pull out that authors choose their words or phrases carefully in order to demonstrate their attitude or their tone or their perspective towards a particular topic. And so this text itself demonstrates that he has a very negative and disappointed and angry perception of the white man, but he doesn't have to say it explicitly. He can use words such as dangerous snake, spirit water, deceitful drink in order to bring out his perspective and his tone. One of my biggest shifts in mindset and how I approach planning is how I think about the central message or the main idea of the text that we're working with. Anchor Standard 2 is determining the central message and using key details to support that message. And a lot of times when we approach a text, I'm guilty of this as well, we have students read the text and then we jump right into, so what is this text about? What is the main idea of this text? And let's find some evidence to support that. And while that's a very important step, that is actually one of the highest cognitive demands that you can have students do with the text. For lifelong literacy, we want students to be able to read and pull out what the main idea is and what the author's trying to say. But when we're engaging in a text in the classroom and when we're trying to scaffold for student learning, finding that central message or determining the main idea is one of the last things that we do before finishing our text engagement. So as we're reading through, as teachers, as we're planning, as educators, we want to think about what is that central message that we want students to get to, and how am I going to question them? How are we going to interact with the text? What graphic organizers are we going to use? What discussions are we going to have? So that as students walk away from the text, they finally craft or determine that central message. When we approach planning like this, then it allows us to see how much deeper we need to engage with the text before asking that question of, so what is the central message of this text?